Today we're going to walk you through the story of flamethrowers, explain how they work in the modern world, and show how they evolved into something far deadlier than the fuel tank backpacks that first appeared in World War I. So let's start from the very beginning. The idea of spraying fire on people goes far back in our dark and violent history. You've probably heard of Greek fire, which was so feared and effective hundreds of years ago that we still don't even know today the right recipe for how they built it. It burned even on water and was impossible to extinguish. It was projected through siphons under pressure to set enemy ships and, well, people on them on fire. So we can freely say that this is the closest thing to a flamethrower in history. But the flamethrower shape we know today, in backpack form, actually came in the First World War as one of the desperate and brutal attempts to break the stalemate of trench warfare. Germans were the first ones to introduce their Flammenwerfer in special assault pioneer units specifically trained for this weapon. They had cylinders with flammable liquid under pressure and a nozzle with a device at the opening that would set the fuel on fire once it left the hose. Germans developed two main flamethrower models: a heavy, static, crew-served one with hundreds of liters of fuel, and a smaller portable one for a single soldier carrying around 20 liters of fuel, enough for about 20 seconds of fire, reaching 20 meters at best. Although fire was proven to be the best way to deal with heavily entrenched, stubborn infantry, it didn't prove as effective as it would be in the next global conflict. Germans first tested them near Verdun when, just before dawn, they crawled close to a French trench and sprayed fire over them, engulfing soldiers and spreading total panic. The effect was much more psychological than it was actually eliminating soldiers, and soon soldiers began running just at the sight and sound of a flamethrower operating nearby because obviously, nobody wanted to be close to it. Then the Allied American and British soldiers were about to experience flamethrowers for the first time during fighting at Ypres, when again, in the same style, German pioneers crept up near the trenches during the night and attacked at dawn, spraying liquid fire over trenches, followed by grenadiers throwing a series of bombs into dugouts. In just a couple of hours, Allies suffered some 500 casualties from flamethrowers, and a whole brigade was nearly wiped out. Panic quickly set in through Allied ranks. It wasn't long before they began developing flamethrowers of their own. But instead of a backpack mobile flamethrower, the British had a better idea and created something called the Livens Large Gallery Flame Projector. Now, this was a monstrous 2.5-ton flamethrower that was assembled on the front line inside secret tunnels dug under no man's land. It was essentially a huge pressurized barrel with flammable mixture that hurled a flame stream over 100 meters. Two of these things were fired during the Somme offensive, and they reached and incinerated sections of German trenches. British infantry found quite a few charred bodies during the attack, and those that survived were too shocked to keep fighting. Many surrendered. The British later also used smaller portable flamethrower models, but in very few actions as they were too heavy and short-ranged for what they needed. Also, it was quickly realized how dangerous it was to use one, as several quite horrifying accidents happened with flamethrowers. Germans, for example, had a model where one soldier carried the fuel tank while the other had the nozzle. In one British soldier's memoir, he wrote how the fuel tank man was shot and dropped, pulling the nozzle out of the hands of the operator and going out of control, setting several German soldiers nearby on fire. There was also an instance where a whole German squad was taken out by their own flame when a sudden wind changed direction and blew the fire stream back at them. Not to mention that no one would like to be set on fire, and the whole front would turn on the man with the big fuel tank backpack, while the fire clouds would surely grab the attention of artillery observers and attract all the artillery fire available. Also, you wouldn't want to be captured as a flamethrower operator either, same as a sniper or a spy. Your best outcome was to be shot on the spot, and there was also a high possibility of quite rough treatment before that. So given all the risks and limited effectiveness, the flamethrowers went out of World War I as specialized assault weapons and weren't given much development in the interwar period. Then came World War II, and yet again, Germans were the ones to use flamethrowers at scale during their blitzkrieg tactics. They pioneered the flamethrower tank, the Flampanzer III, basically a Panzer III with a flamethrower instead of a main gun. It saw some service on the Eastern Front, but not much. And the Allies were actually the ones motivated by the German idea to make really effective flame tanks. But we'll get to them in a moment, because it was actually the incredibly high casualty rate of foot flamethrower operators that forced them to consider flame tanks seriously. The United States was initially lagging behind, not giving much care to flamethrowers, but then had to catch up and developed their M2 flamethrower that would see heavy combat once the fighting turned to the Pacific. Americans also perfected the fuel mixture, finding the right mix of gasoline, diesel, and thickening agent, turning it into what would become napalm. This way, it clung to everything, dripped and burned, and was much more effective when sprayed over fortifications. You see, flamethrowers were the only means of effectively knocking out well-fortified positions, like when Americans faced Japanese pillboxes, caves, and tunnels in their island-hopping campaign. They were built to withstand heavy bombardment, even naval guns, and dropping a grenade inside wouldn't do much. They had specifically made grenade trenches inside and small holes where they could kick the grenade in to reduce the blast. Also, fortifications were made always in a zigzag pattern inside, so one blast would affect soldiers just in that small chamber, and after the explosion, it could quickly be reoccupied again. This wasn't the case with a flamethrower. The mixture burned at an extremely high temperature, and in confined space, even if you weren't directly hit by flames, air temperature would rise so quickly and so much that the air you'd breathe in would burn your lungs from the inside. I have to be careful how deep I go into this because this is YouTube, but the lungs, after being exposed to extremely hot air, would swell and fill with fluid, and you can only imagine how that would look or feel. Then, this is a pretty similar effect to chemical weapons used in World War I, like mustard gas and phosgene, which would have a horrible effect on lungs, cause swelling and accumulation of fluid inside, and the cause of death actually was drowning. Now, when these obvious horrific effects were objected to as causing unnecessary suffering, someone responded with quite interesting research that suggested that death by flamethrower might actually be instantaneous and painless. The idea behind it is that the victim lost consciousness due to the sudden shock to the body, and they, quote, wouldn't feel anything. However, if you saw any footage of the aftermath of flamethrowers, which, by the way, I don't recommend you look for, you'll see that this theory isn't quite holding up. Then, if the flame or temperature doesn't get you, the fire would consume all the oxygen inside, and you'd have to go out of your fortified position whether you liked it or not, and you couldn't come back in for some time. No zigzag pattern and grenade trenches will help you in this case. The first biggest use of flamethrowers in World War II was definitely during the Battle of Iwo Jima, where also, for the first time on such a large scale, flame tanks were deployed. Americans converted about 8 of their Shermans into dedicated flame-throwing tanks, the so-called Zippos, after witnessing how horribly short life expectancy was for man-carried flamethrowers. For example, on Iwo Jima, it was measured on average about 4 minutes until a flamethrower operator was taken out after the battle started. Remember, that range was only about 30 yards, which is dangerously close, and you'd have about 30 seconds of total firing time before going empty, with your pistol as your main armament and standing so close to the enemy position that it might not be completely destroyed. Malfunctions also happened to flamethrowers and either got their own operator burned or failed to fire, after which the enemy could capture you and take revenge for what you were about to do to them. Not to mention that distinctive backpack of yours would make everyone want to shoot you as soon as possible. So, to solve the problem of being vulnerable with short range and small fuel capacity, Americans also deployed flame Shermans for the first time on Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, where they cleared Japanese fortified positions with devastating effectiveness. They could project flame now for about 100 yards and for a longer time, and they operated constantly through those battles and burned tens of thousands of gallons of fuel mixture on Japanese positions. The British had a quite effective Churchill tank modified into a flamethrower, the so-called Crocodile. It even towed an armored trailer with fuel so it wouldn't be stored inside the tank and could carry more of it. It saw action during fighting in Normandy and terrified German soldiers, who would usually surrender when Churchill Crocodiles started firing. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets even had flamethrower booby traps, notoriously used in the Battle of Stalingrad. They were rigged to a tripwire that an unfortunate German soldier would trigger and activate, and they were terrifyingly effective. Even the Germans developed similar versions of these, the so-called defensive flamethrowers, to fend off attacks from buildings. However, after the experience in the Pacific where the biggest action of flamethrowers was seen, someone got the idea to use the very effective fuel mixture and change the delivery method instead of a soldier on foot or tanks into airdrop delivery. At first, this was improvised with drop tanks filled with napalm and released by fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt. Yet again, it was first used in combat in the Pacific against Japanese forces, and after immediately proving how effective it was, it became standard payload for bombers. However, once the B-29 Superfortress came to bomb the Japanese home islands, these at first improvised incendiary bombs turned into something outright disturbing. These were M69 cluster bomblets filled with napalm. They were mixed in with standard high-explosive bombs and dropped in combination with them to create firestorms in Japanese urban areas. To make matters worse, Japanese houses were built mostly from wood, which is easy to set on fire and spread. This way came the deadliest day in history in Operation Meeting House, when on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, Tokyo was bombed. About 300 B-29 seconds dropped over 1,000. 600 tons of napalm incendiaries that engulfed the city in fire. Just in a single night, an estimated 100,000 people perished in a huge firestorm, setting the record for most people lost in a single day. So after World War II, although already causing serious concern with their brutal effects on the human body, flamethrowers and incendiary bombs were not abandoned, quite the opposite. The backpack flamethrower was improved a bit, while the flame tanks transitioned the same principle from Sherman into M48 pattern, creating the M67 Zippo flamethrower tank. Some of the M113 armored personnel carriers were also transformed with a flamethrower system inside, and they entered service just in time to see the fighting in Vietnam, where they would yet again create horrors to be talked about for years. At the beginning of the war, backpack flamethrowers were used to clear Viet Cong tunnels in which there were also many civilians hiding and living during the war as well. Then came Zippo tanks and APCs where vehicles could operate, and they were quite effective in jungle combat and against fortifications where firing ports were well camouflaged. There was no hiding from fire. All types of flamethrowers saw quite some action during the conflict. Even the Viet Cong used Soviet and Chinese-supplied flamethrowers and shocked Marines on one occasion when they crept up to their fortified positions and fired flamethrowers at them in a combined attack with mortars and machine guns. U.S. Marines were shocked and terrified by flames, so they abandoned their positions and ran straight into mortar and machine gun fire. But what Vietnam actually became notorious for was the napalm itself. The air-delivered method was the most horrible one for several reasons. Fighter jets could deliver 500 and 750-pound napalm canisters to obliterate the enemy in jungle, for which they were more than effective. Americans dropped about 340,000 tons of napalm during the war, but with it came two horrible problems. First thing was that the North Vietnamese were well aware of American superior firepower, so they used the so-called grabbing the belt tactic. They always tried to fight as close to the American forces as possible to either deny them artillery or air support or to make it riskier for friendly units, which, in the case of napalm, happened quite a bit. Napalm canisters sometimes behaved unpredictably, and because of jungle terrain, low visibility, and close proximity between enemies, it was easy to miss the intended target and hit friendly units or even civilians. Quite a few villages were burned down by napalm with horrible effect on local people, and you have those infamous photos you can find on the internet? We couldn't even include them on YouTube. Medical workers at evacuation hospitals described injuries by napalm as the worst. Equipment, uniform, and skin would all melt together, and there wasn't much they could do for those unfortunate enough to get hit by sticky jelly burning at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The stench was also described as unforgettable. So, because of all this, after the Vietnam War, under public pressure, the flamethrower was officially retired from the U.S. Army. Napalm wasn't yet banned, but in the 1,980 seconds, a protocol was adopted which restricts use of incendiary weapons, although workarounds were still allowing them to be used even in more recent conflicts like using white phosphorus bombs under the disguise as a special smoke screen and so on. But that's another topic. However, fire wasn't actually banned as a weapon. It just changed form because a new and even more effective weapon was then developed, the thermobaric. The idea of thermobaric weapons continued the flamethrowers' purpose to get a very destructive, area-denying effect that would clear complex fortified positions resistant to all other weapons. So, instead of spraying flammable liquid over a fortification, thermobaric munitions were ingeniously deadly. Because they disperse a large quantity of combustible fuel around the target in the form of an aerosol or cloud, let it mix with oxygen, and then ignite it. The warhead on impact bursts open and disperses the fuel as a fine spray that spreads well through bunkers, caves, and buildings. That mixing with oxygen is what gives the system its explosive ability. Then a second charge fires milliseconds later and ignites the airborne mixture, creating an extreme overpressure wave. Unlike conventional high explosives, thermobaric charges produce a longer-lasting elevated pressure. And that matters because a short, sharp blast from a regular explosive tends to punch holes and throw fragments, while a long, sustained pressure pulse flexes and collapses light structures, and it drives pressure into cavities where people shelter. The human body is brutally vulnerable to that. Rapid changes in pressure can cause massive internal injuries, collapse the lungs, and force air and fluid into places it shouldn't be. And those blast effects are then compounded by intense heat. If the blast doesn't finish the job, secondary fires, the destruction of protective cover, and the resulting lack of breathable air and toxic carbon monoxide and other combustion products in the cloud frequently do. You see, this is why thermobarics were much deadlier than any handheld flamethrower. They're effective in the open, but in enclosed spaces, the effects are simply horrific because the pressure and heat are amplified inside. The Soviet Union pushed this concept faster than the Western Allies during the Cold War, and even classified some shoulder launch systems as flamethrower weapons. Weapons like the RPO Schmel family put thermobaric effects into a man-portable rocket that saw service and combat use, and larger systems followed vehicle-mounted platforms, such as the TOS-1 multiple rocket launcher, used thermobaric warheads to clear cave complexes, bunkers, and urban strongpoints in a way that conventional artillery simply could not match. They were terrifyingly effective compared to earlier incendiaries or standard HE rounds because they spread a combustible cloud and then detonated it, creating that crushing, sustained overpressure and massive thermal load. Legally, thermobaric weapons are not categorically banned by the Geneva Conventions, but they sit close to the edge because of how devastating and indiscriminate they are in populated areas. In doctrine, their use is supposed to be constrained in urban settings and where civilians might be present. Though we all know how those so-called rules of war are followed in practice,